Record heat waves in Europe and Africa, droughts in southern India on an unprecedented scale, hurricanes more frequent and violent than ever, and wildfires in, of all places, the Arctic. The global news media are, after decades of looking the other way, finally waking up to what scientists have long called an emergency: climate change. Take Covering Climate Now. It's an alliance of more than 300 media outlets, including this one, currently running 1 week's worth of climate coverage in the lead-up to a summit on the subject in New York City. The shortfall in the coverage of climate change and the shortcomings expose the ugly, irresponsible side of modern journalism, particularly the corporate kind. The chase for ratings and revenues mean the media are complicit in, and not just observers of, an economy dependent on fossil fuels. And that's a big part of the problem. Our starting point this week, once again, is the planet Earth. A global media consortium, a journalistic collective, the size and reach of which is commensurate to the story. News agencies like Bloomberg, AFP in France, and Getty Images. U.S. television networks, Univision and CBS. India's News 18, SVT in Sweden, and Al Jazeera in Qatar. Asahi Shimbun and La Repubblica, the most widely read newspapers in Japan and Italy, respectively. More than 300 media outlets on 6 continents, with a combined audience of more than 1 billion people, all brought together by 2 American publications, The Nation magazine and the Columbia Journalism Review, to talk about one issue: climate change.
I thought there is a critical mass of journalists out there who want to be doing more and better climate coverage. And that's what led to this project, Covering Climate Now. And it has been remarkable to see the way that so many outlets have stepped up. Big outlets, small outlets, radio, TV, print, online, and all over the world.
So much of the climate journalism that we do is about our country. It's very insular, and this is a global issue, and especially a lot of the polluters cross borders. Today I was reading a story about sewage systems in Philadelphia, and we have the exact same problems in Johannesburg, here where we are. So this seemed like an opportunity to join up in newsrooms and tell our audience for a week that here's an issue that the whole world is dealing with.
The consortium's strategy was to have all of its members churning out a week's worth of environmental reporting leading up to September 23rd and the start of a major climate conference in New York City. For participants like India's Hindustan Times and South Africa's Mail and Guardian, the core subject is the same, the stories markedly different.
So in South Africa, one of the big problems we have is we have such a big carbon footprint as a nation, right?
But if you look at India, our per capita emissions are extremely low. They are lower than the world average.
Our power utility, Eskom, then Sasol, which is a petrochemicals company, and then a few other industries. These are all relics of the apartheid regime, where it built these incredibly polluting industries that affect the communities that live next to them. And they also have a huge impact on releasing carbon emissions.
It's good to put a human face to the climate change story, and I think this is an opportunity to do that. And at the same time, track the conference in New York, track it as effectively as possible, look at what the government here is doing and what it plans to announce.
As impressive as the consortium's joint output has been, the question begged is, what took them so long? The New York Times had this page-1 story on a scientist working for NASA predicting much of what we are seeing today: record heat waves, droughts, and sea level rises if global warming went unchecked. That piece was written 31 years ago, in 1988. What followed has been not just a failing of governments, but of news media as well, part of which is a continuing failure to connect the dots. U.S. broadcast networks ABC, CBS, and NBC all recently gorged on the coverage of Hurricane Dorian.
Some of the wind gusts here in the Outer Banks, over 80, 90 miles an hour.
But of the 216 segments they put to air over a 1-week stretch, only one mentioned the possible causal context: climate change. One. Very few journalists have covered the climate change beat since that New York Times article in 1988. The Guardian's George Monbiot is among them. Why has it taken this long and this concerted a lobbying effort to get the media outlets where they need to be on this story?
If you look at the billionaire press, the newspapers owned by billionaires, they have a very clear interest in not emphasizing climate breakdown, because doing so directly offends the commercial interests of the billionaire class as a whole. In the broadcast media, it's long been perceived as counter-aspirational.
Today, I'm house hunting on the stunning Caribbean island of Antigua.
The programs they like to make are all about wonderful houses and amazing things you can buy and great holidays you can go on. And climate breakdown and environmental breakdown more generally are the spectre at the feast, saying actually all this apparent progress is progress towards disaster. There's been a layer of top executives in the media who have been not just indifferent to these issues, but actively hostile to them. I've met journalists from Mexico, from India, from Southeast Asia, who all tell me the same thing. They themselves as journalists are desperate to cover the issues, but the senior figures within their organizations just keep nixing it. They keep saying no.
Because, in the end, money talks. And when it does, many media outlets listen, and some go quiet. Since the Paris Climate Agreement of 2016, the 5 biggest publicly traded oil and gas companies have spent around $1 billion trying to shift the narrative on climate change. Some of that is spent on lobbying that happens out of the public eye, but it also pays for the branded content advertising you may have seen on a newspaper's website.
And should the weather change, yet again, our natural gas can step in to keep the power flowing and the lights shining.
Or the ads that have grown common on the American airwaves. Slick, feel-good messaging.
It's getting the attention you deserve, but the privacy you desire.
At a time when the standard of covering climate change is finally improving, advertising often works against the journalism. And with media starved of revenue like never before, news outlets face a dilemma. Take the ad money or leave it.
You have to rely on advertising. So at the Mail and Guardian, we have a strict divide between the commercial side and the editorial side, but we can veto adverts if we think they're not in line with our editorial policy or they are lies, basically. So we do try and hold our adverts to a better standard, but you know, you need money to do journalism. So at the moment, this is where the money is.
I want to talk about something you wrote way back in 2007. The editorials urge us to cut our emissions. The ads urge us to raise them. Do you see a tension between those two imperatives?
The tension is almost overwhelming sometimes. I get a lot of complaints from my readers about it, and it's right across all the media. You get the advertisements pushing us towards what we know is disaster. I would like to see media outlets ceasing to take advertising for oil companies, for gas companies, for cars, for planes, for holidays which require flights. And I don't think that's too much to ask. These are industries which should be on the way out anyway.
As impressive as the list of companies that took part in all that climate change coverage is, the list does not tell the full story. Consider the organizations you do not see here, the ones that chose not to take part, for reasons ranging from the journalistic, to the ideological, to the merely commercial.
I did make efforts to reach out to most of the biggest U.S. news organizations to invite them to be part of Covering Climate Now. The New York Times has declined, the Washington Post declined, the Wall Street Journal declined, the Los Angeles Times declined, CNN declined, NBC News declined, ABC News declined. They did not want to look like they were part of a campaign or trying to push a certain agenda on their readers. We differ with that point of view. We think that it fundamentally misses a key aspect of journalism, which is to try and cut through the fog and tell citizens, here's what you need to know about your world, and here's what you can do about it.